Well, we're continuing the story in John chapter 3. It's a title with a question. What's the story? What is the story? What's the story? What's going on? Sometimes you remember Paul Harvey saying the rest of the story. What is the story to start off with? We heard some amazing stories yesterday at a memorial. And one of those stories was James Sturgeon, who used to be a diplomat, spent at least 10 years in Vietnam, and actually did some espionage work, believe it or not, while he was in Vietnam, and also was there during the very last evacuation of Canadian citizens in Vietnam. There's actually a picture of him, not of him, but of the helicopter on top of, can't remember what it was, an embassy? Embassy building. Yeah, and people climbing up a ladder to get to the roof to get on. He was actually there, present, guarding that operation. So just to give you an idea of where he was and where he lived and what he did. He was a very fascinating character. Lots of stories. The rest of the story, like what's the story? So we've been looking at their story, his story, and our story. Their story being maybe a story from somebody in the Bible, Nicodemus. Maybe one of these stories. And then his story, the story of Jesus. The gospel. You know the Gospels, 4 Gospels, it says a gospel according to Matthew, according to Mark, according to Luke, according to John. So the gospel is not just that Jesus died, was buried, and rose from the dead. The gospel is the entire story of Jesus. All of it. It's a story. It's a true story. It's a historical reality. Somebody tried to suggest that, Jesus was a made-up story, but other historical figures were real. I said, well, actually there's more historical precedent and evidence for the existence of Jesus than Caesar Augustus or any of the Caesars. There's more documentation. So just when you're challenged by that, Jesus was a historical figure, and there's evidence for his resurrection. It's fun to go through that and to explore what that looks like. But if you want help with that, I'd be happy to help you explore that kind of thing. But there's a story. It's a real story, right? And so we need to get to know each other's stories. We need to ask each other to tell us more. And so that's what we've been doing. We camped out a little bit in John 3 last week. We'll do it again this week. We're still in the first 21 verses. And the story continues. So Nicodemus comes to Jesus and says to him, he meets with him on a rooftop at night. We watched a video of that, an idea of what it might have been like. For no one could perform the signs you're doing if God were not with him. So Nicodemus is a religious guy. He's got position. He's got education. He's got great stuff behind him. He's a better religious guy than probably any of us. Certainly than me. Maybe not you. You probably had a leg up on him. But he was a very good guy. Okay? Despite being a Pharisee, he was a Pharisee in the sense that he obeyed all the laws and wanted to honor God and wanted to defend truth. All of those things. Right? So Jesus replies, very truly I tell you, no one can see the kingdom of God unless they are born again. So Nicodemus walks into a trap of sorts. Anybody who comes into Jesus trying to trip him up, or even just curious, he'll usually come back with a question, but sometimes a very provocative statement. If somebody says, you're a good man, and Jesus says, why do you call me good? It's like, well, why? I don't know. It kind of takes him off guard. Well, Nicodemus is taken off guard. He's like, what? I didn't even ask you anything about being born again. I just said, you're a guy from God. I get it. You're a special person. You've got to be a special person. And he says, hey, look, Nick, let's just get down to brass tacks. Let's just get down to basics. You got to start over. He's like, start over? What are you talking about? Going to my mother's uterus, into her womb? She's probably not even living anymore. And Jesus says, no, Nick. Man, you got all this education. It's actually getting in the way, right? Sometimes schooling gets in the way of education. No offense, honoring teachers. But formal education can get in the way of education in the sense that sometimes we miss the plot, right? By the way, I actually plan to include a prayer for teachers. Ann and I were talking about it earlier today, and we've been listening to teachers, and we've been listening to students. We've been listening to teachers. I happen to work in a school or actually function in a way that lets teachers know I care about them and I'm praying for them. And what I would call trauma that teachers are experiencing and admin are experiencing in this last year is probably unprecedented post-pandemic. So just to keep this in mind, now that I've trashed formal education by saying it can get in the way of life, let me just reestablish that we want to honor our teachers and administrators and our students who are trying so hard to finish the year well, and it's hard. This is probably one of the hardest years to finish well. Good weather, post-pandemic, restlessness of kids, it goes on and on and on and on. A lot of pressure. And so pray and be kind. Pray for teachers and be kind to them. By the way, I hear all the teachers telling me, in generic terms without telling me names, the kind of comments that they get from parents. And there are a few encouraging ones in there. But can I just say that could you be the encouraging parent? Could you be the one, the parent or grandparent, who sends an email and says, look, I don't know what happened. I just want you to know that I care about you and I'm praying for you. Just be supportive. Start out positive. You can get to the critique later if you need to, but first ask questions. So that's just my word from being on the inside and empathizing with what they're going through. They're trying desperately to show love and care for your kids who are trying to develop resilience. So here's a religious guy, but missed the plot, missed the boat. So what we can learn from his conversation with Jesus is, yes, Nicodemus lost the plot. He lost the big story. And here's why. I'll sum it up before we have an interview on stage here in a moment. See, religion can't save us, can't rescue us. Can't rescue us from sin, from death, from the consequences of our choices, from ourselves. So you may have developed a religious system that's very elaborate. I know some people, when they grew up, they went to church 4 times a week, 5 times a week. I was in a church at one point as the part-time or interim pastor. And I remember one week needing to prepare for and attend 5 different Bible teaching times in a week. And I remember thinking, I can't apply one of the 3 points in any one of those 5 sessions in a given week. I can barely make application of one of those 15 points. All right? That was a very religious environment, a very churched environment, but a lot of meetings where meetings equaled spirituality and maturity. They doesn't. And for Nicodemus, he had something to learn. Well-educated, good position, religion, according to Jesus, was not going to save Nicodemus. He had to start over with the basics. And then we read Ephesians 2. Leroy read it earlier, that it's by grace that we're saved. It's not religious things, it's not good works that gain favor with God or gain merit. Nothing you do will make God go, oh, you're such a good person. Come on in. Because that's not how he operates. It's not the economy that he works with. Okay? You're not in his family. You don't get into his family by doing good stuff, and you don't stay in his family by doing good stuff. So we'll explore that a bit later. But later events in Nicodemus' life indicate that he probably or possibly experienced new birth. So in John 7, we have a story which isn't on the screen. It's a story of Nicodemus in the Sanhedrin. People are trash-talking Jesus. And he says, whoa, wait a minute. Couldn't we at least hear him out? Well, why do we need to do that? He's a jerk. He's an apostate. He's a blasphemer. Well, don't we normally hear people's story before we decide that? So Nicodemus shows up in John 7. That's all we know, and he's just crushed by the majority. So minority voices aren't always wrong. They're just not always heard or followed. So then again, all the way in John 19, post Jesus' death, but before the resurrection here, it says Joseph of Arimathea, a wealthy guy, was accompanied by Nicodemus, a guy of high standing. So Joseph of Arimathea says, well, I got this tomb. I'm sure you'd have to be wealthy to own your own tomb and be prepared to put your bones there. Was accompanied by Nicodemus, the man who earlier had visited Jesus at night. They took Jesus' body, the 2 of them wrapped it with spices in strips of linen. So this is part of a ceremonial work, essentially a religious ceremony of honoring those who had passed on. So why would Nicodemus have risked being associated with an executed criminal along with Joseph of Arimathea unless there was something else going on? It's possible Nicodemus was kind of a closet Christian, we could call him, or at least a hesitant one. If you watch the Chosen series, again, creative imagination is used, creative license. But the suggestion in the Chosen is that he was in process, and between John 1 and then John 3 and John 7 and John 19, along the way, there may have been a progression of him wrestling with what would it mean if I turned my back on all things religious and followed Jesus. Do we know anybody else who in the New Testament did that? The Apostle Paul. The Apostle Paul gave up status, position. He said, I don't want anything but Jesus. Anything that I had before, I count nothing compared to following Christ. So Nicodemus doesn't quite get there in the book of John, but we have hints that he moved from darkness to light. That comes up later in John 3. From ignorance to illumination, from spiritual death to spiritual life. That's also in John 3. From religion to relationship, something we're going to be exploring. So there's just a couple of the lessons we can learn from Nicodemus from the Gospel of John. First is God's posture toward us is toward us, for us, and not against us or condemning us. John 3:17 states clearly that for God did not send his Son into the world to condemn the world, but to save the world. So I was mentioning this at the memorial yesterday, that when it says in Psalm 23 that surely your love or your goodness and mercy shall follow me all of my days, that means that God is pursuing you. The Good Shepherd is pursuing you with his love and mercy. Sometimes we think, I come running back to God with my tail between my legs, and I go, and God's like this. Not again. You got to be kidding me. Yet we don't see that posture in the New Testament. If Jesus is the exact representation of the Father, then what physical posture do we see Jesus having throughout the Gospels? Never this, not again. Always this. Let the little children come to me. Let the prostitutes come to me for grace and mercy. Let the publicans and the sinners, the tax collectors, even the Romans, even the centurions. God, Father, forgive them, for they don't know what they're doing. What? Every discourse, every relationship that Jesus has with people in the Gospels, his posture is facing them, giving them eye contact, asking them to tell him more, even saying, "What can I do for you?" One of his most common questions. What can I do for you? I'd like to be healed. I like this. I'm hungry. My son died. My daughter died. My daughter's sick. My friend. Lowering through the roof of the house and healing and forgiving all at once. Everywhere his posture is this, all the way to the cross and towards you. And you feeling like you are the most important person in the world when he's with you. That's the posture of Jesus. He did not come to the world to condemn it. He came to save it. So God invites us away from darkness into light. That's another thing we can learn from John 3:19-21. Then another little lesson. It's hard to identify with Jesus in the minority, isn't it? That's another little side lesson from John 7. Remember, he stands up for Jesus in a sense, stands up for justice, and he's squashed by the majority. Okay, we won't go into detail. So I'd like to invite Gregg up. He and I have been having an ongoing conversation, and I thought, wouldn't it be great if we had that conversation in front of each other, in front of all of us here, to explore. Come on up, and we'll set up some stools, and I've got some questions that I've been asking him. So, thanks. Because what's a conversation without coffee? I have my coffee. Yeah, so Gregg, tell us a bit about Gregg Pearson, my friend Gregg Pearson, if you don't know him already. Most of you know him better than you know me. Tell us about your family growing up. Tell us about your siblings and just about. Ready for a pop.
I grew up in a strong Christian family. That there was 4 of us kids. I have an older sister, and then there's me, and then a younger sister, and then a younger brother. So there was 4 of us, and strong Christian family. I believe that I was raised in a very dynamic religious family. My mom and dad served in the church, plus they had their own personal ministries. My dad he sang, and when they got married, mom and dad sang, and they traveled all around the country singing in different churches, mostly churches and venues like that. And then us kids we got to be along with that. And we also farmed. So I was raised on a farm, and so we had a dairy, and then we had a mixed farm as well. So there was always lots going on, and we're pretty busy.
You were the favorite kid, right?
I don't think it was, actually.
Okay. Did everybody, you reflect growing up, was I the favorite kid? Was I not? Or we all loved the same?
Yeah, no, I don't think it was. But in all fairness, I don't know who was. So.
Yeah, good. That's a good sign. So after high school, you pursued some religious education, you went to Bible college or something, and then you did some ministry opportunities as a young adult. Tell us about that.
Yeah, well, I think starting off, in grade 10, our church was fairly big and had a lot of youth, and so I got asked in grade 10 to be the president of the youth, and the youth in the church ran an executive just like the church did. So I was involved in that, and by the time I graduated, I was pretty comfortable leading and stuff like that, and everyone was going to Bible school after high school, and so I decided that's what I should do too, and possibly prepare to be in ministry, probably as a pastor. I think I was thinking that way. So I went to Briarcrest in Saskatchewan, and had a wake-up call about what it's like to not be with people that you know. There was almost 1,000 students there with the high school, and I was a number, and I felt very insecure and discovered that I wasn't very mature, and learned a lot of Bible there, but I chose to not go back the next year. I just felt like it wasn't a place where I wanted to be anymore, and had second thoughts about being a pastor. That just like that turned that around. So during that, I didn't realize that there was a reason that I wasn't going to go back the next year, that God was in. I hadn't picked that up yet, but there was a reason. So
yeah, and then you went on to, you came home, and then you wanted to study somewhere else, or did you stay home? What was the next?
Yeah, well, I came home that year, and farmed with Dad, and then that spring, the next spring after that, my dad had a brain hemorrhage where his blood pressure was off the chart, and he didn't know it, and he had a brain hemorrhage leading a men's choir in our church, and didn't know what was happening to him. So by the end of that service, we were in the ER and into the U of A, and the doctors didn't think my dad was going to live. So that was a tough time.
So Greg, you were 19-ish.
Yeah.
Your dad,
yep, he just turned 19. Yeah.
And your dad is 50.
Yeah, he was 47.
47, and he's primarily operating the whole operation of the farm.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Yep.
So what did that look like for you?
Yeah. Well, I remember that was on Sunday. So we managed to find a neighbor to milk the cows that night, since we were all at the U of A. But then by midnight, we realized some of us have got to go home. And earlier, a doctor had said that he's not going to make it. And then a senior neurologist came out and said the bleeding has stopped, and they believe that he's probably not going to die as soon as they thought. But they didn't think, with the amount of bleeding on his brain, they didn't think he'd be able to live. So my brother and I, we went home with one of the pastors from our church. We went from Edmonton back to the farm at Wetaskiwin, where I grew up, and went to bed and got milk cows in the morning. So Dad was still alive the next morning, and there was no possibility. He's completely paralyzed on the left side of his body and not responding. So we just started to take over the farm. My brother was 15 or 16, and we just started. I had no idea what was ahead of us, but I knew we milk cows every 12 hours. So that's what we did. We milk cows. Of course, we're also calving a beef herd at the same time, and which is a little bit more automatic, but it was still freezing at night, so we were calving in March. So yeah, so then I just got totally sidetracked from anything that I had as a goal or a thing I would wake up in the morning wishing to do. Is I began taking my dad's role and not being able to ask my dad what to do, because he couldn't talk, and he was, for the first week, he wasn't conscious really. So I just remember learning well, I've seen my dad do it, so I could do it. So we started calving cows and milking every day, and there's lots of complexities. There's the management of a farm, and then what happened is we got into spring, the booking of seed and deciding the plans for the acres, and next thing you know, I'm running the drill. Dad had a pretty big drill. I'd never run it before, and that's what I did, seeded everything. And my brother, he was in high school, so he'd get up early and milk cows, go to high school, come home, and then he had a cousin that helped him milk at night. Way too young.
Eventually, you felt free to follow what you thought was your calling, and you went to Bible college. Is that how I understand the rest of the next part of the story?
Yeah, I'd say like what happened was Dad's against what the doctors said. When you have a brain bleed or when blood gets into places in your brain where it's not supposed to be, that causes paralysis. So that's why Dad lost his, paralyzed one side of the body and lost his speech. And then there's other things he lost. He had perfect pitch and sang all his life. He lost his tone. He sang terrible after that. Anyhow, what happened was his body started to clean up the areas and that had been smothered by, it's actually your own blood that smothers your brain cells when it's not in the right place. The body started to clean that up, and Dad started coming back. He learned to talk, and the one side of his mouth and face started to lift a little bit, and then he was able to start using his hand a little bit. In 3 months, my dad was up on a walker, and they were teaching him to walk again. So now it's midsummer. And so my dad progressed to the place where he left the hospital, and we had a bedroom set up downstairs in a house for him. And believe it or not, he got to the place where he was functioning again. I mean, there's capacities that were missing, like his ability to reason and make quick decisions. That disappeared. His music and love for music disappeared. Or I wouldn't say his love did, but his ability did. And then he never did gain all the feeling in his leg. So after Dad hired a guy to help with the dairy and full-time. And so that fall I registered to go to North American Baptist College and started to work on what I'd started at Briarcrest and continued there. So as I got involved in the college and in my degree, then I was very active, and I was freed up from the farm to be able to do things that I love to do. So I'd actually achieved a first-year apprentice in machining in high school, so I was able to work on that in the wintertime, and I was teaching Sunday school and a youth sponsor in our church, and then I played in a band as well, so a lot of time was put into that. So just lots of ministry type of things that I did and that I love to do. I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, so over the next few years, you were involved in ministry opportunities, ministry training. You were building on this background that you had of faith, growing up in church, growing up in a faith family. At some point, you started to have some interesting questions or some interesting evaluation, or tell us about that a little bit. What was kind of going through your heart and mind that might have been at odds with maybe where you sat when you were younger?
Yeah, well, I think didn't realize it, but I was probably a really religious kid, super religious, and I was really well at speaking Christianese. And when Dad had that brain hemorrhage, I remember that'd be like the first time that God let you down. And I remember at the hospital going, God, what are you doing? Like, this is crazy. So if you, sorry about my emotions, but if you have a belief that if you do all the right things, like go to church and read your Bible and do lots of ministry things and do everything for God, and if you have that belief, and then like you think you're doing the right stuff, and then your dad, that happens to you with your dad, I just ask God, what are you doing? Like, this doesn't make sense. So that was probably the beginning of kind of like a reorganizing of my belief system. But I would say, unfortunately, I strove harder to understand my theology, thinking I'd missed something, and finished my degree in associate arts in religion, and was looking for more ministry. And I think what I was disconnecting with the fact that Jesus wanted a relationship. He didn't really care about, well, I shouldn't say he didn't really care, but the theology that I understood, and like I would teach and systematically teach theology to youth, thinking, this is what you need to have. You got to understand that you're a sinner, and that even if an Adam and Eve wouldn't have sinned, you probably would have, because we just choose to go against God. And I just taught that, and then I taught, and here's the solution. Christ saw you in your helplessness as a sinner, and he sent his son, or God saw you and sent his son Jesus to die for you, and he did what you couldn't do. He died and rose again, and you're going to die because of what your rebellion towards God. So you need to go. Like, I used to understand baptism as a water grave. Like, when you give your life to Christ and you baptize and you go underwater, we'll just put the lid back on the tank because you're dead. It's stunning. And then when I got baptized, I realized, it's not you that stands up. It's the pastor lifting you out of the water, representing Christ, taking you out of death. And if you could do baptism in that way, you would still be underwater. Mm-hmm. Because if you're alive, gasping for air, it's because of Christ holding you, not you. And so some of that theology I taught, but still didn't focus on that what you do doesn't really make a difference. It's what Jesus does. Like the whole understanding of trying to be holy because you know so much doctrine or can argue doctrine, that isn't what makes you holy. It's Jesus that makes you holy. Mm.
So you've told me that you identify with Nicodemus somewhat in the story in John 3. Tell us about what ways in which you identify with him. In terms of what's similar, his story and your story.
Well, I think the fact that he was a Pharisee, we've sang songs about Pharisees and Sadducees in Sunday school and at camp, and so nobody wants to be a Pharisee. But Nicodemus was a Pharisee, and if you look at who a Pharisee is, they're actually very studious. Like, they've done a lot of work reading. And they didn't have an iPad with 4 translations on it. They're going through scrolls, and they didn't have the New Testament. So I admire a Pharisee in that way. But I think that I was, in hindsight, I see that I thought that knowing everything of Scripture and of theology was most important, and I'd argue it. Like, I'd argue it with people, argue theology, but it didn't help them get saved. And I've realized that theology doesn't save anybody. It's Christ. So I think I relate with Nicodemus because he was really towing the line. Like, and we don't know much about Nicodemus, but the video, I don't know if you all saw the video last Sunday, was that? Yeah. There's some creative license there, but it helps you see how, he's reasonable. He's coming to Christ at night so that he's not making a scene, and he's saying, really, dude? Like, you're supposed to be born again? Like, he's reasoning. He's not just shutting them down. And I think that's I admire that about Nicodemus. And there's a verse, and I can't tell you where it is, but you might be able to if I tell you. It says that your righteousness has to be greater than a Pharisee. So that might challenge you to be even more theological than a Pharisee, but that's not what the verse means. Because it doesn't matter what you do. Like, it doesn't matter what I did. I was still, even though I understood all this, I'm no more righteous. And the only way to become righteous is to stop doing and let Jesus make you righteous. And he does. Christ makes us righteous because he replaces life that we're trying to earn. He said, just die to that. Just let me live in you. And then we're righteous.
So you had some real advantages. Some people in this room would be going, wow, if I just would have grown up in a Christian family, had mom and dad, went to church, mom and dad were together, weren't killing each other. I wish I could have what you had. So you did have some advantages. Now, you told me earlier that you guys had family meals together, probably more than once a week.
Oh, yeah, and every day.
Every day. So imagine, family meals together, mom, dad, all the kids, eating together, a meal. How was your day? How was your day? Tell me about school, right? Some of us in this room never got that. Some of us didn't grow up with mom and a dad, let alone meals together. And it's actually becoming a decreasing reality for many families because of busyness and double incomes and things. But so you had many advantages. What might you consider a disadvantage, or what did not necessarily set you up for success or for a healthy faith as an adult? What may not have set you up for a healthy faith as an adult? You had many advantages. You know, I've talked about, this might have given me a bit of a deficit or giving me a bit of a hard time. Help me miss the plot like Nicodemus. What might have been part of that?
Well, I think one thing would have been my belief that going to church and being good, like, I chose not to hang out with unsaved people because I was better than them. It's terrible. That's what I thought. Got invited by unsaved people in high school and said no. And they just wanted a relationship. They didn't care. But so I think my thinking that I am achieving this through my religiosity. Mm-hmm. That's what's achieving. So that was a huge, like, that's not helping at all. Yeah. And that's one thing that I can think of. Yeah. I think I don't think mom and dad were wrong in their involvement in ministry and how, I mean, what you do, your kids pick up on, right? They were from a different, of course, they're from the 50s and the 60s, so things were different. But I think that what somehow, and it's probably because I'm a sinner, I just didn't pick up on the fact that a relationship with Christ is is the only. Well, even just thinking about the guy on the cross beside Jesus, like he didn't go to Bible school. He wasn't raised in a Christian family. He didn't go to church. He didn't do any of the stuff. He wasn't baptized. He didn't do anything. He just looked at Jesus dying on the cross and said, remember me. So it can't be like all of the stuff we do and stuff we learn. It can't be the thing.
Yeah. So one of the disadvantages, another way of putting it might be, and Gregg and I have a similar background in some regards, in terms of, we joke about fundamentalism, but we both grew up in a combination of fundamentalism and evangelicalism in a church context. It had many advantages, especially family values, eating together, praying together, being a part of a church family, those kind of things. Possibly the disadvantages were a formulaic, and by the way, that's not unique to fundamentalism. Formulaic approaches to religion go all the way back to Nicodemus and beyond. Okay, so a Jewish understanding at the time was, I live right, God blesses me. You'll see it all through the Gospels. And the negative side is the disciples say, hey, was this guy born blind because he was a sinner or his parents were a sinner? And Jesus is like, what is up with this formulas, you guys? These formulas. That formula doesn't work. So Nicodemus grew up with formulas. Get the right religious education, have the right family, do the right stuff, good stuff will happen to you. The general belief in a Jewish culture in that context was, if you live right, you won't get cancer or leprosy. And if you do, there was something wrong with your life. You weren't living right. Have you not heard this among evangelicalism or among Christianity? I don't know, they might be living right. I mean, their kids have turned away from God. It must be the parents. Formula. Or, live right, my dad won't be paralyzed or die, or whatever. Or, bad things won't happen to me. Oh, I hope I didn't sin yesterday because tomorrow my daughter's going to graduate and something bad might happen to her if I sin today. Formula. You will not find that in the Gospels. You will not find that in the Gospel. There's all kinds of things we've added to our religion that you will not find in Jesus or the Gospels. And yet we've added it, and we can get tripped up by it. So those formulas, we've got to examine them. Is this a formula of Jesus? Is this really a Jesus thing, or is this something I've added as baggage to my faith? So I don't think we're talking about deconstructing Christianity or the Gospels. I think we're talking about doing what Jesus said to Nicodemus. Hey, go back to the basics. Hey, Nick, you need to be born again. You need to start over, man. Like, education, awesome. Position, I get it. But Jesus is like, no. You missed the plot. Let's go back to the basics. And for you, you're telling us the basic was, it's about what Jesus has done, and it's about my relationship with him. Is that a bit of a sum up?
Yeah, I think so. And even more so that theme of starting new. So when you accepted Christ, maybe you did that as a one-time experience. Maybe someone led you through a sinner's prayer or something like that. That was a great start, but in how Jesus said to Nicodemus, he's describing a beginning. Born means starting something. So to be born again, that theme is all through the gospel in how we are being transformed. And the best thing is when even just coming from the Old Testament, from Ecclesiastes, where it says every morning God's love is God is great is his faithfulness, and his mercies are new every morning. So the idea that whatever happened yesterday, start again, because we don't accumulate our ability to have to be right with God by what we've done. And for the last 4 months I haven't sinned, so I must be doing really good. No, every morning I don't start this day without Christ living in me, because I'm already dead. And anything that a dead guy tries to do isn't going to be any good. So that whole idea of being born again, of course, it's like a new beginning each day. And so that changes it when you're a rule keeper and a list, doing all the right things. All of a sudden, that list doesn't matter because every day it's wiped clean, and no one's picking it up again. We just live by faith each day. So I think that those are things that, like, that's one of the things that is really overwhelming to me. It brings me, when we sing songs about grace, it brings me emotion, is because how amazing it is that each day God's grace is there for us. And the word grace is 5 letters, but it's so huge what God's grace is.
Yeah.
We don't understand it. We can't put it in a bag and say, here, this is God's grace. It applies in so many dynamics. So the whole idea of trying to accomplish and build a reputation and a list of things I've done right, it's just all pointless. It's almost like when, as the psalmist says, all your righteous stuff you do is a filthy rag to God. That has no value. Well, of course it doesn't, because each day you get a new start, and it's not what you did, it's what Christ does. So,
oh, thank you so much, Greg, for sharing. I wanted to partly focus on this as well as we close, that Nicodemus' story was in development. So we see John 3, 7, 19. The only place where he's mentioned is in the Gospel of John. But we see a progression. We don't even see the end of the story, not clearly, with Nicodemus. But our story's in development. Okay? We believe in a developmental culture, a discipleship culture in which we are becoming. You can call it a growth mode culture or a growth mindset. In other words, don't give up on yourself, because Jesus has not given up on you. Don't give up on your sibling or your child or your parent or your spouse, because they are still in development and their faith is not fully formed. As a matter of fact, they may come to a point where they go, by the way, that's what conversion is. It's changing your mind, it's changing your heart, it's changing the direction, the trajectory of your life. Jesus does that. And that can happen to anybody, right? All of us, to some degree, have experienced that conversion, the initial one, or many other conversions, a conversion of our wallet, of our heart, of our choices, of our relationships. There's all kinds of conversions, the primary one being the initial one where we're born again, and then a whole bunch of other ones, right? And all coming back to the righteousness of Jesus Christ and his sufficiency on the cross, dying in our place. Any other thoughts that you wanted to share before we close?
well, I think just lately, just from doing some reading, like just a simple phrase like, well, one of the things that we're trying to get to heaven. I mean, who in here doesn't want to go to heaven? And so we say, well, we're trying to get to heaven. Well, from this, we acknowledge that it's not what we do to get to heaven. We can't try. It's Christ that does that. But for me, what's more important is not to worry about getting to heaven. It's about heaven getting into me. And if heaven is God's kingdom, and the king, wherever the kingdom is, the king is. Mm-hmm. So each day to let the kingdom start off in me rather than worrying about getting to heaven. That's kind of like an overall challenge I think about a lot. Don't worry about getting to heaven. Worry about getting heaven into you.
That's good. Yeah. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, thank you so much for Gregg and his story. Thank you that he was able to share part of his story with us. Thank you that you are not finished with him yet. He's got a vest on that says under construction, and that's true for all of us. Thank you for Nicodemus' story, that he was under construction. And we get just a little bit of his story in the book of John. But thank you for your clear words to him. You must be born again. We must be born not only physically, but we must be born spiritually. We must start over, go back to the basics. No matter what our position, what our education, no matter our pedigree, whatever it might be, We all have to come to the foot of the cross and say, Jesus, nothing I have to offer you is good enough. Nothing I have is righteous. And even my best acts are filthy rags to you. I can only come and receive your mercy, to accept your acceptance of me based on what you did for me on the cross. Thank you that you offer that to each one of us. We're all in progress. We're all in process. We're all, to some degree, a bit of a mess. But the glory goes to you, Jesus, because you're the one who saves and rescues us. You're the one who gives us your goodness, your righteousness. Thank you. In your precious name, Jesus. Amen. Thank you for being here. And if you want to know more of his story, you can say, tell me more. God bless you. Have a good week.